You will lower the front end exactly 1/2 inch, but it has been lowered quite a bit and I'm liking the new stance. Welcome to Big Son Hobbies. Today I'm going to continue focusing on lowering the ride height on my Element Ecto and thus lowering the overall CG. In one of my earlier videos, I showed you how to mod the rear trailing arm setup and drop the rear ride height by 1/2 inch or 12.7 millimeter, thus lowering the overall center of gravity. If you haven't seen the video yet, I'll include a link at the top right corner, so go check it out. However, the simple mod does not affect the ride height of the front end, so that the front end sits a bit too high for my taste. So I've been looking for a few options, and there are typically a couple of options out there. First option, and probably the cheapest option, is to pick up a shock key such as from IRC. This will allow you to relocate your upper shock mounting point angled inward, thus lowering the ride height. The pros is that it's fairly cheap at around $10. Also, it does not change the body mounting position, so you get to keep the current hole on the Ecto body. As for cons, there isn't much con when you consider that $10 is fairly cheap for RC part. The second option is to replace the front shock tower to a metal version, and they will typically have many more mounting positions, thus serving the purpose that we're looking for. Here I have a beautiful piece from Rock Pirates RC that I picked up at the Pro Line by the fire. You can clearly see the different shock mounting positions. The pros is that it's much stronger piece, so it will get rid of any flex on the plastic shock tower, and it offers tons of shock mounting position. As for cons, it's the most expensive option. Typical metal shock towers ranges from $25 to $45 range. Additionally, it might change the body mount position, which means that I'll need to drill new holes on the Ecto body, and that's something I'm trying to avoid. On my LCG Element build, I found that modifying the shock to lower the shock overall height by a few millimeters really helps. So I had planned to do this mod on my Ecto, and at the same time add some green slime to minimize any leakages when I rebuild it. And that got me thinking, why don't I take it further and use that to lower the front end? So here's the third option. I'm going to do a couple of simple mods to lower the front end ride height about 1/2 inch or 12.7 millimeter. And at least for me, I'm using stuff that I have. So it ended up being the cheapest option for me. And the biggest plus is that I don't have to change the body mounting hole. Here you can see the difference. The right side has the mud done, and the left side is in stock location. You can clearly see that the distance between the axle and the chassis is much shorter on the right side than the left side. Here are the things that you will need. Green slime is not needed for lowering the ride height, but it will help seal the O-rings and reduce possible leaks. A 30 weight oil. Ecto comes from factory with 30 weight oil. I find that 30 weight oil works well for me on the front end, so I'll use that for my front shocks. You will need quantity 2 of 5mm shock limiter. A friend of mine 3D printed a few for me. If you have access to 3D printer or have a friend that has a 3D printer, it's probably the best way to go. If you don't have access to a 3D printer, then you can use a 1/4 inch nitro fuel line cut to 5mm each. You'll also need quantity 2 of the 25mm screws and quantity 2 of the washers. You'll reuse the 3mm spacer that comes on the Ecto, but the 20mm screw is a bit too short. So let's get started. First mod is to rebuild the shock and use the 5mm shock limiter. You can remove the shock by loosening 2 screws holding it. Now that the shock is free, let's tear it down. Remove the shock spring cup by lifting the spring, and you can push it up to pop it out. Then remove the spring. So next I took a measurement of the shock shaft and it's 26.7 millimeter long. We will need this info later on, so that both the shocks are the same length. The shock limiter I measured as well, and it's 4.95 millimeters long. Now unscrew the shock cap and dump the oil. Unscrew the rod end. Remove the shock bottom cap. Note the order from the bottom. There's a washer, O-ring, spacer, and another O-ring. And now you have all the shocks disassembled. Now let's rebuild. Here the order doesn't matter, but I like to put together the bottom first. Add green slime to the O-rings and add them back in the order. And don't tighten the shock bottom cap yet. Insert the 5mm shock limiter to the shock shaft. And carefully insert them to the shock body. And then install the shock bottom cap. Install the rod end. Remember the shock shaft was 26.7 millimeter, and we installed the shock limiter that is 4.95 millimeter. So the new shock shaft length is 21.75 millimeter. Tighten it down until it is 21.75 millimeters long. Now we'll need to add oil and bleed it. Pull the shock shaft down. Add oil to the top of the shock body. Slowly move the shock shaft up and down to remove air from under the piston. Let it sit for a few minutes for bubbles to come up to surface. Fill the shock body to the top with oil. Push up the shock shaft. Normally, you would add a drop of oil in the cap to lubricate the O-ring. But since the oil is there, you can skip it. Install the cap and tighten completely. Check the shock by slowly compressing the shaft all the way to the top and bottom. You're looking for any resistance, and if there's pressure at the top of the stroke, then there's too much oil or air still, and you will need to bleed it again. But it looks good. Now reinstall the shock spring. Push up to install the shock spring cup. And you're done. You just installed a 5mm shock limiter inside. By adding the 5mm shock limiter, you have effectively lowered the front end by 5mm, but we still have a bit of ways to go to lower it further. So here's the second mod. I'm going to relocate the upper shock mounting position by angling it inward and mounting it at the same height, which effectively reduces the ride height by leveraging the body post mount. I'm going to relocate the upper shock mounting position from here over to here. The body post uses a set screw. Remove the set screw. We will reinstall it using the longer 25mm screw and a washer. Insert it into the shock pivot ball and use the 3mm spacer. I'm actually going to use an aluminum spacer that is the same height. And carefully tighten down the screw, ensuring that the screw doesn't crush the body post mount. Move the body post mount and align it carefully as you tighten it down. The screw is tightening down on plastics, so be careful to not over tighten it. Here is what it will look like after both sides have been modded. It will lower the front end exactly 1.5 inch, but it has been lowered quite a bit, and I'm liking the new stance. It will lower the front end exactly 1.5 inch, but it has been lowered quite a bit, and I'm liking the new stance. All for basically for free. I hope that you found today's mod informative and useful. Please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified of future videos. Thanks for watching Big Song Hobbies.